No man do they call me, my mother and my father, and all my comrades as well. Hey everybody, this is No Man, and I kind of wanted to do something a little unusual and do something unscripted for you guys. For those of you who do not know, I recently graduated from my master's degree program, and I now have a master's in clinical psychology. And one of the things that I try to capture in a lot of my stories is kind of um, the psychology and also the philosophy of Warhammer 40k. Um, and considering one of the things I wanted to do was kind of do a thought experiment where I was thinking about the different mental health needs of the far flung future, in the grim darkness of the far future. And as one might expect, there are quite a lot of them. Uh, I wanted to focus just on being a guardsman. I think there's a lot of different kinds of misery that exists in the far flung future, and some of which are kind of hard for us to discuss because it's difficult to understand what kind of trauma somebody might experience from being converted into a servitor. And it's like, well, what all happens there? What neurologically happens? How do you but you know, a guardsman is a person, and by and large part, they're experiencing the way normal people do. Um, so I think the two most common, well, I don't think this is just a fact. The two most common mental health concerns that most people have are various depressive uh, disorders and anxiety disorders. Um, and I would expect that to exist a lot in for guardsmen. A lot of what guardsmen are going to experience are things that most military people experience, and I think the one that people talk about a lot, and I think sometimes people talk about kind of lightly, is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, um, which is a very intense kind of anxiety disorder where you experience something so traumatic, it can be um, debilitating. Mostly because, uh, well, let me back up a little bit and talk about what anxiety is. Um, Anxiety essentially is a fear and stress response. Um, you have two different kinds of ways of experiencing uh, anxiety. One is essentially uh, you're really stressed out. It's worry. Like you're worried about something. You think a lot about something. You're stuck inside your own head. And you get a lot of stress hormone pumping in your system called cortisol. So if you're in a constant state of alertness and you're constantly dealing with high stress, that is likely going to be the sort of anxiety you are dealing with. So developing a fear of artillery, like you're constantly dealing with artillery barrages, that slowly wears on you. um, PTSD, on the other hand, is usually an acute thing. That there are certain moments from it can be a single moment or it can be a bunch of different moments where someone experiences something that is just, um, quite frankly, very traumatizing. Usually, this when this happens, uh, people have like a specific picture in their mind. So, like, I've spoken to veterans before, and oftentimes uh, there'll be pretty grisly scenes that they've come across, and just something about them like sticks in their mind as just being particularly awful. And so that's probably going to be pretty common amongst guardsmen, if any of them have actually seen action, um, and have seen combat and have been up close and personal with the enemy. Uh, they're going to be seeing some gruesome things. Uh, as a consequence, you're instead of having the stress hormone coming into your system, what you do is you have like an acute fear reaction. Uh, which is a much stronger. That's going to be adrenaline. That's not going to be cortisol. That's like It's time to fight, fight or flight. You need to act now. Your heart rate increases. Your awareness of your surrounding increases, and your body gets hyped up to like do something. And that can be very distressing if you are like, you know, not out on the battlefield. On the battlefield, it's going to be useful because you're paying attention to what's all going on. You're very tightly wound. But re-entering civilian life, oftentimes people actually kind of make a joke about it, of a car backfiring, and then a veteran reacts to that, is suddenly will like flinch at that. Or I spoke to a veteran uh, of Iraq, and there were like certain things he would see that, like, because he was concerned with improvised explosives, uh, IEDs, and he basically would see, a car parked funny, or things arranged in a certain way, or like a pile of garbage, and like he'd like have a PTSD response to that, of like, uh, a life. Suddenly he's now in his mind has put him in a life or death situation. So that would probably be a pretty common thing for uh, the guard. Now, now, in dealing with the grim darkness of the far future, things are going to be a lot worse in this fantasy setting than in the real world, because it's kind of everything's turned up to 11, 12, 13, way beyond 10. Um, and so what I would expect uh, among guard units, if they've seen any kind of action, is there to be a great deal of trauma and a lot of mental health issues, especially if they're being deployed for a long period of time. Because if something bad happens, and you have an engagement and you lose friends, you see a lot of violence, the enemy is particularly horrifying, um, and you're able to get mental health treatment. You're not out in the field for very long. It's a relatively short kind of fight. You can get treatment and start to be able to move past it. But if you are out on a long deployment, you can end up kind of building up all of the different mental health issues, a lot of different traumas, a lot of different anxieties, a lot of stress, and that can come out in a lot of negative ways, especially when you're in the military and you need to respond a very particular way at a very particular time. You have to follow orders all the time. So generally what's going to happen is you have to stifle. You're in a stressful situation. You're messed up. You're traumatized, but you have to shut up and kind of follow orders. Your mental health problems kind of compound and multiply, and they end up coming out in really negative ways. So I would expect, in a typical guard unit, I would expect, um, especially ones who have been through a lot, um, I would expect there to be a lot of really close camaraderie between the people who've survived everything together. I would expect a lot of hostility towards new people that get added to the unit. Um, Probably, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a very strong hazing culture, of like basically tormenting new recruits to almost like make them suffer some of what you had to suffer. Um, Again, without any mental health things available. Like, I've heard people talk about mental health services being available to the guard, and they actually have pretty good medical care. They have space medical care, so it's better than what you have on Earth today. But if you're in a war zone, you're not always going to have the best care available, and you're not always able to like sit down and talk about your feelings for an hour. Um, so I would expect I would expect a lot of drug use, especially with uh, a lot of drugs that are given as combat stims within the universe that they have a lot of drugs. I would expect, so they have access to drugs. I would expect a lot of drug abuse. I would expect a lot of dependency. Um, I would expect a lot of neurological damage. Essentially, there's going to be a lot of side effects to anything that you are taking, probably in not very careful measured doses that are psychotropic. Like that's eventually, no matter what you're taking, it will take a toll on you. And if you're dealing with pretty intense feelings of trauma, that's going to be you're going to need stronger stuff in order to self-medicate. So I would expect they're taking fairly extreme stuff, just to kind of a lot of things to like numb themselves. I would expect probably abuse of anti-anxiety medication, uh, something that would be equivalent to a space benzodiazepine, opioid abuse, or something like it. Uh, Anything that kind of takes you away from the way you're feeling right now. Um, I would also expect there to be a fair amount of psychosis, because one of the things that's going to happen, if you're under a lot of stress, you can have a psychotic break. For those of you who don't understand what psychosis is, or like uh, schizophrenia is psychotic. Psychotic symptoms are essentially hallucinations, auditory, visual hallucinations, um, disjointed speech and thought patterns, and also believing in strange, nonsensical things. Like I wouldn't be surprised if there were guardsmen that believe themselves to be the emperor. If you're having like grandiose delusions, or if you're having paranoid delusions, that people are watching them, or that there are bugs everywhere, or a bunch of different things like that. And I think psychotic disorders would also come about because if you're abusing a lot of different psychotropic medications, that makes psychosis more likely. So I would expect there to be a lot of people suffering psychotic symptoms, and I would also suspect, given 40K's attitude towards, uh, the demonic and kind of traditional human notions of what possession is like, is not unlike what psychosis looks like. Talking about things that don't make sense, declaring yourself to be an angel or a demon, is having a lot of religious themed delusions is not uncommon. So I think I would highly suspect that the military in Warhammer 40K would not be very tolerant of psychotic cases, and would not treat them, and instead would probably just execute someone who develops psychotic symptoms. And I would guess that would be fairly common. Probably more common, like psychotic disorders are not very common. They're a fairly rare thing, but it does happen. And I think that serving in the military in the grim darkness of the far future, anybody who is predisposed to developing those symptoms almost certainly would, just given how impossibly stressful and miserable serving in the military in Warhammer 40K would be. One of the things that would be a strength, it would be religious conviction. If you have people who have a lot of faith, if they kind of have it in the right way, it can be a very strong way of dealing with depression, dealing with anxiety, dealing with stress, dealing with distress. That if you believe that things happen for a reason, or that the suffering that you're going through is happening for a higher cause, it can make you more resilient to what's happening. So I think that could be very helpful. But it can also be it can do the opposite, where if you come to rely on religion or faith in a certain way, it can also do a lot of damage because it failed. Because if you feel that it failed you, it's like I put my faith in the Emperor, and like all of my friends died, and I've like lost faith. So that can make you like more vulnerable. Um, and this is just kind of general stuff. This isn't specifically talking about what's going to happen for people who like have to fight Tyranids, or people who have to fight deal with the Dark Eldar, or all of the different pretty horrifying enemies that the Imperium of Man has to go on. I'd also expect that there would be a lot of there'd be a lot of soldiers who would become very depressed. I think there'd be a high rate of lack of motivation. Um, they have like indoctrination programs, but indoctrination is it doesn't like eliminate the stress that you feel. Like you still you can be indoctrinated to believe something, brainwashed to believe something, um, but you still feel kind of all of the stress that the indoctrination's tells you to like ignore it and just and do it for the Emperor. It's like, well, all that's still there. It's just gonna manifest as mental disorders the more you are exposed to the horrors of the galaxy. So I would imagine that mental health would be a high concern for the commanders of the Astra Militarum, because if you have people who have severe mental disorders, they're not going to be very combat effective, and they can like having a bunch of unwell people together in the same place is just stress for everyone else around them. Like if you're in a military situation and you like need to rely on other people to do things, you can't have other people in your unit that are having psychotic breaks and seeing things that aren't there, or being paralyzed because they've been horribly traumatized. And I would expect that one of the things that you'd try to do, if it was possible, is to have pretty frequent rotations at the front of not having people on really, really, really long engagements where it's like you're talking to, if you're on a battlefield without being rotated for like 6 months. I don't know how you get through that without having some very serious problems. So I think they probably ought to have uh, a fair amount of consideration for treating things, and I think a lot of it because the Imperium is also a giant bureaucratic nightmare that reflects our own society in a negative way. I think they'd be pushing a lot of medication. I think that a lot of their issues would be them trying to solve it by medicating their soldier and pushing them and pushing them and pushing them, and then when they're not really useful anymore, I don't know, kind of getting rid of them or leaving them as a broken heap and discharging them on whatever rock they end up on at the end of their tour if they survive. I think a lot of it would be they would be giving them metaphorical band-aids to kind of treat mental trauma until they either died or the campaign's over, in which case, you know, the new administration that takes over the planet they just conquered can deal with the horribly traumatized, discharged military guys that now have to try to function. Which I think would vary widely as to what kind of quality care they're going to get, depending on what shape the planet's in, depending on the culture of the people that are there, if like mental health is something they value, etc. So yeah, this was kind of just a ramble, and I literally just felt like talking about mental health and the grim darkness of the far future for a little while, and I hope that was interesting for you guys, and I hope that just kind of talking about it off the cuff is a format that you guys enjoy. If you don't, if you prefer me to just do the stories and things like that, I can get back to that. I just had some time, and it wasn't enough time to like write a giant script and do something. But my brain was dealing with mental health issues, so I just put out this kind of off the cuff, and I hope it's something you enjoy. So if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and thank you all for listening. I'll have something else out tomorrow, hopefully. No Man out.